let me begin with a couple of brief announcements. The first is that unfortunately I will not be able to return the papers to you today. I will return them on Tuesday because I wasn't able to finish the grading, but you will have them back on Tuesday, and I'll take a few minutes on Tuesday when I return the exams to you to discuss some issues that came up while I was reading the exams. The other thing I want to mention to you is to remind you that I don't know why this isn't. Just a moment. To remind you that when you have the final exam, which, as I mentioned to you on a number of occasions, is it not coming through?
Oh no, I was just going to help you with the computer.
No, that's okay. I just had forgotten to plug it in. Yeah. Should be okay now. Let's go back. Just a moment. We're being. Yeah, there we go. Okay. All right, so I want to remind you that you're responsible for everything on the syllabus, okay? And that means the lectures, the readings. There are some readings that I have discussed with you in detail. I'm going to do that today as well. I'm going to look at some of the selections from Gandhi and Women. And there are obviously other readings that I haven't been able to discuss. But you're still responsible for them. So I just want to alert you to that so that you can start preparing for the exam adequately. And once again, you're going to have at least, I think, 5 days, possibly a couple of more days, but I'm not sure about that. But you will get the exam at the end of class, the last class. That's the Thursday of week 10. All right. Now, before I commence my lecture, are there any questions from anything that we have covered thus far that you want to clarify? Because there is no, review session or anything of that kind. We don't really have the time for that, and it's not been, scheduled in the syllabus. Yes.
Question.
Yeah.
Gandhi fathered 4 children.
Yes.
Those 4 children was. And I forget her name. His wife, was she the mother of those children, or was that before he married her?
Oh no, she's the mother.
She is the mother.
Yeah. His only children are from his wife.
Okay.
Yeah. His wife's name is Kasturba,
right.
And then he had 4 sons: Harilal, Manilal, Ramdas, Devdas. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned for your class that on the day that Gandhi died, one of his sons were found in a gutter drunk.
Yeah.
What about the other sons? What happened to them?
Well, it's a long story, but Manilal, one of his sons, had stayed behind in South Africa to carry on the work that his father had been doing in South Africa. 2 of them, the other 2, in addition to Harilal, the oldest son, who, as I said, was alienated from his father in particular. So Ramdas and Devdas are back in India. Devdas becomes an important figure, not, of course, anywhere as important as Gandhi, not even remotely as his father. But Devdas is the editor of a newspaper called the Hindustan Times, and he is married to a woman whose father is himself a very key figure in India in the first half of the 20th century, moving into. He becomes actually the president of India at one point. So that is Devdas's father-in-law, right? So the family still has a lot of descent. There's still a lot of descendants. I know actually quite a few of them, quite a few members of the family, including a man who passed away a few years ago, Ramchandra Gandhi. He was a philosopher. And then there's another, and so he's the grandson, and then there's another grandson. His name is Rajmohan Gandhi, and he's even been a member of the Indian Parliament. So one could go on and on, but it's a fairly large extended family. Yeah, Melody.
From your lectures, it almost sometimes sounds like you're saying Gandhi almost single-handedly lead to the independence of India.
Yeah.
Like, what if, let's say, Britain never entered World War II and was therefore never weakened? Do you think Britain would still have given India's independence? Because a lot of people say it was because
Yes.
Britain was so weakened by World War
Well, so there are two separate issues here that you're addressing. One is your reading of what you think of I've been saying, which I'm not. So the two separate issues are, one, Gandhi's role, and secondly, was Britain weakened as a consequence of World War II, and therefore did that hasten the departure of the British? So let me address the first one. I'm not trying to suggest, even remotely, that Gandhi was singularly responsible for the Indian independence movement. No, I've maintained a number of times that he is, I think, unquestionably the leading figure in the movement. But that's a different statement than saying that he single-handedly was in some sense responsible for creating the nationalist movement. Now, I think that, for example, the transformation of the Congress from an organization of Indian elites into a mass organization, that is indisputably the role of Gandhi, right? The second half of the question, was Britain weakened as a consequence of the war, and could one argue that Britain abandoned India, or was willing to abandon India, or quit India because it was weakened by the war? Well, to some degree, that's unquestionably the case, right? That is the fact on the ground. That in 1944, 1945, in 1945 at the end of the war, although you have to remember that Britain's role in the war is pretty much ends in 44, because the war with Germany ends earlier than the war in the Pacific with Japan, right? Where the Americans were much more involved at that juncture. But in any case, 44, 45, what is very clear is that Britain has been weakened. I mean, there are lots of cities in Britain that have been bombed into rubbish heaps, frankly, at this point in time. But we have to, of course, be much more nuanced in our understanding of this, because this would, in effect, say, if we were to pursue this line of inquiry and not look at all the other considerations, this, in effect, would be saying that, well, Britain really had no interest in holding on to India any longer. It did. It had a great interest in holding on to it, and one reason among many is the realization by the British leadership that the minute you lost India, it was the end of the British Empire. And the minute you lose the empire, Britain becomes reduced to a second-rate power, which is exactly what happened. Britain has absolutely no standing in world politics, frankly, today. I mean, you can talk about the special relationship between England and America, as they do sometimes, and that's because of the Anglo background, of course, of the United States itself. Britain is not really a significant player in world politics, and has not been, notwithstanding all the noise that is made, so forth and so on. Right? But there was a clear realization of that. And of course, then you can also take an answer and you can look at the spectrum of world history. When does a power give up its possessions willingly and voluntarily? How many occasions have we had of that happening in world history, for example, right? So forth and so on. You see, so you could build a case. The other way to build up a case and say that, well, actually, no, the British had really no choice except to leave India, is to look at what happened in the 20s and 30s, which is exactly what we've been doing. That in effect, India had made it very clear to the British that, frankly, you're not really welcome here any longer. That you have no standing any longer. Whatever might have been the things that justified British rule in India, that offered the pretext, even that pretext is no longer really there at this point in 1945. And the moral standing of Britain had really diminished enormously as a consequence of the anti-colonial struggles. And do think of what happens in the second half of the 20th century. What is the greatest political movement in the second half of the 20th century? It's called decolonization. Decolonization. When Britain and France, the two major imperial powers, are progressively stripped of all of their possessions. I have to remind you that 1/4 of the world was under the Union Jack in 1900. 1/4 of the world, right? And so what really made possible decolonization in the first instance was the anti-colonial struggle in India, because it was the anti-colonial struggle upon which the world's eyes were set. Now, to say that is not to minimize anti-colonial struggles in other parts of the world, not even remotely, because there is an anti-colonial struggle in Indonesia, which is under Dutch rule. There's going to be one in Algeria, a well-known one we know, but that's later. Now, there we're talking about the late 50s moving into the early 60s, right? And of course, it had a very different kind of outcome. And one of the interesting things to ask here, and we will address this question in week 10, is whether the nature of the anti-colonial struggle in India was markedly different and therefore led to very different outcomes. Because if you look at countries that became decolonized, right, all over the world, in Asia, in Africa, in most of these countries, the vast majority of these countries, the experiment with democracy did not last. Most of these countries became authoritarian regimes. India was the great exception. And again, to say that is not by any stretch of the imagination to argue that India became a perfect democracy. Of course, I'm not making that claim at all. And I would not make that claim even for the US. Far from that, as you all know by now, right? But what is very clear is that the outcome in India was very different. And one of the reasons it was different is precisely because of the tenor of the struggle in India. It had, even if Gandhi himself was authoritarian, the outcome was democratic institutions, which survived 1947 and which survived to this present day. The Supreme Court of India, for example, is an exceedingly important institution, and that cannot be said of the vast majority of the countries that came under colonial rule and were then subsequently decolonized. All right? So I think that addresses your question. Any other questions? Yes.
There's a cost to colonization for England, but there's a benefit economically also. But at that point in 44, was it more of a negative from an economic point of view to maintain the colony, and was that a consideration?
Well, so you see the economic aspects, if we were doing a course on colonialism as such, this is not a course on colonialism as such, although we have obviously, when we're looking at Gandhi, we're touching upon those things, then we would have to look at the whole economic aspects of colonialism. Is it the case that colonies were held on to simply because they were an economic benefit to the colonial power? We have to think about something that the French theorist, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called cultural capital. Cultural capital. I'll first explain to you what that means in a broad way, okay, and then you'll see why this notion is important, and it will answer the question you have. And it's also important, the idea of cultural capital, because it helps us understand the singularity of Gandhi. The singularity of Gandhi. So I'll give you two illustrations. One very simply, which will explain to you this with respect to Gandhi, and then in a general way, and then we answer the question. So cultural capital here means, very simply, there's an Indian philanthropist who lives in Los Angeles, who has given money to UCLA as well, and he came here as a graduate student from India to study engineering. And he tells me, and this was the experience that was common for many Indian men. The graduate students who came here in the 60s, they were all almost men. The women, now of course there are women coming as well, but at that time there were men coming in the late 60s, early 60s. And he said that when he came here and got into a conversation with a white person, and they found out he was from India, and if that white person was an educated person, they would say, oh, the land of Gandhi. And all doors would open for him. Doors would open for him. Particularly people who were of a liberal disposition, they'd say, oh, you're from the land of Gandhi. You see, this is what Bordeaux calls cultural capital. That there was such prestige, as it were, attached to the name of Gandhi, that if you came from the land of Gandhi, it would open up the doors for you. Okay? Now, the important thing here is this, that for Britain, India was also a kind of cultural capital. Okay? That even if India is economically speaking a losing proposition for you, which it wasn't. It wasn't. And there are lots of reasons it wasn't, because, for example, when World War II took place, World War I as well, a huge number of Indians fought in these wars. These are not India's wars. But Britain gets a huge amount of manpower from India. Huge amount of manpower. 56,000 Indian men lost their lives in World War I, when India itself is a colony. Right? And there's enormous amounts of mobilization, of course much less than in Britain itself, because India was not a theater of war, except in places like Burma and in northeast India, where the Japanese were going to try to make some incursions, but most of India itself was not a theater of war. It was not threatened by war, although there were places that were evacuated when it was feared that there might be bombing, right? Japanese bombing. But the important thing here is that India was always a colony that was actually critical, even economically, right? But I'm suggesting to you that, let's supposing that some economist who's worked on this says that, well, I can show, the data shows that India was in fact not really beneficial to British, economically speaking, towards the end of British rule. It would still be immaterial. The reason it would be immaterial is precisely because India was a kind of cultural capital for the British. And this is, again, ties up to the question that if you lose India, in effect, you have lost your standing as a great power for Britain. That was unquestionably the case, okay? All right, now I think that it's time to move on to the subject for today. So I had been talking to you in my previous lecture about Gandhi's relations with women. I discussed that at some length here when I looked at his relationship with his wife, with Meerabhen, with a couple of Indian women, just as illustrations, because there are many more examples that one could pick, obviously, who worked with Gandhi very closely, and then his relationship to his own grandniece. And the point at which I terminated my lecture, I'd been discussing to you this experiment, this yajna that he had undertaken, this sacrifice where, as I said, that he had come around to the view that there was some shortcoming in his own understanding and practice of brahmacharya, celibacy, and that because he had not mastered his own sexual urges, this was in a sense mirrored in the unrest that was taking place outside. Right? So remember that the context was Noakhali, where there had been these killings that had been taking place, communal killings. And so, in fact, Gandhi actually goes on what is called a peace pilgrimage through Noakhali. Those are some of the most glorious moments, actually, in some ways, in Gandhi's life, that even many of his critics have admitted that what he attempted to do there. Because when I say a glorious pilgrimage, what do I mean? That he walks through all of these villages in Noakhali, very often barefooted as an act of penance sometimes, okay? He walks through these villages which have been torn apart by communal violence, by religious violence, and tries to talk to the people, you know, what is it that impels you to do this? Why is it that we should restrain ourselves? So forth and so on. Right? And it is during this time that this experiment with Manu and Manu and Abba and Shushila Nair is taking place. And I have suggested to you that there is a critique there, and this critique obviously has to do with the fact that Gandhi exercised a disproportionately influential, played a disproportionately influential role in the lives of these women. And so therefore one cannot really think of something like consent. One cannot simply say that, well, Manu really consented to it, or Abba consented to it. You know, Abba, for example, was already married. What did her husband think of that, right? Of her taking part in this experiment with Gandhi, where they're sleeping naked, not having a sexual relationship as such, but sleeping naked in the same bed. And so there are complicated questions of that sort, and yet I also suggested to you, as I've argued in my long piece, that in fact what's interesting is that Manu and Abba, you know, these young women thought of Gandhi as a mother. They didn't even think of him as a father, which then immediately puts a very different complexion on what was really happening there. But you can bring in elements from what you might call Hindu or Vaishnava theology. You can bring in elements from Gandhi's own life to try to understand what was the precise nature of this relationship, and why Gandhi himself, frankly, was not really troubled by it. I think that, you know, there were people who were pressing upon him to abandon the experiment, and eventually he did. But I don't think he did so because of pressure from outsiders, but he did so simply because there was no longer any reason to continue with it, you know. All right. So, but it raises important questions about whether he was instrumentalizing these women, whether he abused his power in various ways. And I want to make it very clear that I'm not a missionary for Gandhi here. All right. I mean, I'm not trying to make a case for him. What I'm simply trying to do here is to really understand the nature of what he was doing. All right. And I think there's some people who simply say that, well, look, you know, the ways of people like Mahatmas are unknown to ordinary mortals. I don't want to take that view either. That simply because he is in some sense in a different league, so therefore this excuses him. But of course, this is all by way of saying that you have to take everyone with their warts and everything, right? That when you assess a figure like Gandhi, much as you would assess a figure like Martin Luther King or Jesus Christ or the Buddha or the Prophet, you have to take any one of these figures with their shortcomings as well. Now, the question of femininity, Gandhi's femininity, because this whole subject really revolves around gender, right? And what I had described as a feminization of the public sphere. So the feminization of the public sphere meant that Gandhi wanted to introduce a softer kind of politics. And mind you, let me reiterate that simply putting women in power does not necessarily mean the softening of the public sphere, or that you're going to have a different kind of politics as an outcome. Gandhi did adhere to the view that if women were to lead the world, that it's possible that we would have a very different kind of world, right? And he says that in many of his writings, that he looks forward to the day when women will lead not just India, but will lead the world. Now, it may be the case that he took that view because he had what some people would argue an essentialist reading of men and women. And this is a complicated matter, so I want to try to flesh it out in a few minutes, okay? But before I do that, let me just set up the backdrop. The backdrop is that there are unquestionably feminine elements in Gandhi's personality. Having said that, let me at the outset suggest to you what I think Gandhi's model is in many ways, at a very colloquial level. That model is that men must be men, but they must cultivate the feminine within them. And women must remain women, but they must cultivate the masculine within them. All right? That is very simply put the way in which Gandhi is constructing his view of relations between men and women. All right? However, you could immediately pose a question. You could critique that view. What would that critique be? That critique would be that he has an essentialized view of what men are. Because when he says men ought to remain men, but ought to cultivate the feminine, right? Then he obviously is of the view that there are certain characteristics which can be properly be described as masculine, and that women must remain women, but they must cultivate the masculine or the man within them. Then likewise, he has certain conceptions of what is a domain of femininity, that there are certain characteristics which are essential to women. Right? So this is what I mean by an essentialized reading of the notion of who are men and who are women. And as I said, there is a feminist critique of this, obviously, right? However, it seems to me that what Gandhi is trying to do at the same time is to, in some ways, undercut this. Because, of course, what he's trying to suggest is that, look, there are certain characteristics that you're born with, but these are not the characteristics necessarily that ought to define you. That there are certain characteristics that you can build upon, right? Now, for example, when you look at the question of nonviolence, one of the reasons why Gandhi thinks that women might lead the world or ought to lead the world, beginning with India itself, where he has, in a sense, been cultivating these women. He and his cohorts have been working with them, training them in practices of nonviolence and so forth and so on. Having said that, he takes the view, of course, that women are naturally more prone to nonviolence. Now, you might say, well, why naturally? This is where I think there are some difficulties for some people who are going to look at this in an interpretive way. Why should we assume that women are naturally? Is it because, for example, that women give birth and therefore they have a greater respect for the sanctity of life? Right? You could take that view. Or is it the case that because in general, without looking at a woman specifically, that in general women will tend to be less prone to use violence because they'll be outmatched by men, so forth and so on, right? You could argue along all of these lines, right? And in some ways, of course, you could say that the argument has been universalized. Because, for example, any day that you pick up, let's say, a major newspaper, or you go to a major news outlet, they'll talk about, all right, well, there's a bombing going on in Syria. And even women and children, that's a stock phrase. It appears thousands of times in the media every day. Even women and children were subjected to it, right? Because the implication is that the women have nothing to do with this. They're simply the victims of it. The fighting is all being done by the men. Men are naturally more prone to resolve arguments through the use of violence, so forth and so on. And that would be the whole subset of issues that would be contained when we, in this observation that women are naturally more prone to nonviolence. Right? But then you have to modify this understanding, because recall that critical distinction that Gandhi made, which I have referred to on a number of occasions, the non-violence of the weak as opposed to non-violence of the strong. Now, when he's saying weak, he doesn't mean that women are naturally weak. In fact, contrary to that, he's going to say, as we're going to look at some of his pronouncements on women, in fact, he takes the opposite view, that women are naturally stronger, but weak because they have been weakened by the institutions of society, by patriarchal norms, by the expectations that we place upon them. Right? And so the distinction for him, the significance of the distinction was that you cannot really be nonviolent. You cannot really be nonviolent unless, in fact, you have the strength And then you have the strength to renounce that strength. Right? That's true nonviolence. All right? So when we look at his views on women and men, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to try to understand these kinds of nuances. So very simply, if we had to lay it out, we're going to say first, okay, that what Gandhi tries to do is he tries to cultivate the feminine within him. What would be a good illustration of that? His fondness for nursing. Right? But you see, here's the essentialism. The essentialism is that, well, we think of nursing and we associate it with women. But of course, institutionally speaking, that is the case. That is the case. I mean, I don't know how many of you even know the history of nursing, but you know, of course, it really began with somebody like Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War, right? And the idea was that the men are going out there fighting, and then, okay, what role are the women going to play? So one role they can play is they actually start the whole practice of nursing. Nursing really began in that sense in the context of war, you know. And for Gandhi, this was very much the case, because one of the things that he's been critiqued about quite extensively is the fact that in South Africa, during the Boer War, to take one simple illustration, during the Boer War, Gandhi, in fact, actually volunteers as a nurse. But the criticism is that he was, in fact, helping the side that was more oppressive, right? By volunteering his services as a nurse. So forth and so on, right? But what is very clear, if you go back to Gandhi's own personal life, is that for him, it's not associated just with war. Because recall that the first instance in which he starts to think about nursing is when his father is ill. And he describes that episode in the autobiography. This episode is important because it also takes us into some other issues having to do with sexuality and Gandhi's own sexuality and his own guilt. But the episode that he describes in the autobiography and which resurfaces in some ways, his narrative of that resurfaces in some ways later on, is that his father was ill and he had been nursing him, he had been by his bedside, and one evening, while he was doing that, he suddenly felt overtaken by the sexual urge, that he wanted to have sex with his wife, with Kasturba. So he leaves his father's bedside, he goes to his wife's bedroom, and you know, Kasturba is actually asleep. He wakes her up, and they're having sex together, and then there's a knock on the door. The servant knocks on the door and says, "Your father has passed away." And then Gandhi says to himself, you know, I could have been with my father in the last moments of his life, but instead, carnal pleasure overtook me, right? And so he has this guilt about this carnal pleasure, right? But there are many different registers in which one can read this. One has to do with his guilt, one has to do with his notion of carnal pleasure, one has to do with the idea that, well, the wife of a man is simply his plaything. He wants to have sex with her, so that's what she's there for, right? And then this is an idea that he's going to have to renounce. But the other critical element in this narrative is, of course, the issue of nursing. Nursing. And we're simply taking this as an illustration of what I'm describing as the cultivation of the feminine within him, with the modification that someone might say that why should we assume that this is an essentially feminine thing? You know, although institutionally speaking, of course, if you look, let's say, at American society, nursing is a completely feminized profession in virtually every country in the world. Almost completely feminized profession. The only reason men would enter into a profession like this is when the salaries become good. That's when men start entering into professions that have been wholly feminized. If you look at the United States, it's very clear that there are some professions that are entirely feminized, and some which are not. You know, right? But if you look at the history of nursing, it's very clear that men have only moved into it when, in fact, as in the present day, salaries for nurses have become reasonably good. Right? So keep that in mind. And one could talk about a great many other things. So when we talk about the femininity of Gandhi, for example, the care that he expended on his grandnieces, the way in which he looked after them, looked after their bodily needs. I don't mean by that sexual needs when they're growing up, taking care of them as a mother might take care of her children, so forth and so on. Right? One could give many instances of that. Now, let's move to the next sphere. Then there's this complicated question of, so what did Gandhi think about the spheres of life and the division of labor as it's described conventionally, right? That there's a division of labor based on gender in almost every society. And of course, in some societies more than in others, there's an attempt to now overcome it, right? Or to dilute these spheres. But even in the US, where, for example, a substantial portion of women have entered into the workplace, there is still a division of labor for the most part. Now, again, it's being undercut. In some communities, it's been undercut to a greater extent than in other communities. But again, if you look at, let's say, recent sociological studies that have been done, even many professional women argue that they generally spend more hours on housework than do their husbands, especially in marriages where both are employed in full-time positions. Right? So this is what I mean, obviously, by the gendered division of labor. Now, I think Gandhi was undercutting this. So I have a point here. So Madhu Kishore is an Indian feminist who wrote this piece called Gandhi and Women about 3 decades ago. And one of the things that she argues is that, if you read what Gandhi says, much of that seems quite conventional. It seems quite conventional that, that the role of a man is to go out, earn the bread. Put the bread on the table, so to speak. The woman's role is in the home, the domestic sphere, the hearth. Okay? Right? Now, it may well be the case that, yes, Gandhi comes across as being relatively, at least, conservative on this matter. All right? And Kishore's argument is that, in fact, actually, Gandhi is doing this for strategic reasons. That is that he cannot come out in a country such as India, right, where by and large women had been confined to extremely domestic roles, that he cannot, in fact, come out and say, well, I don't believe at all in the gender division of labor. If you look at what was happening in his ashram, I've mentioned this on a number of times. Now is the point to reiterate it, that in the ashram itself, men and women partook of jobs equally. There were men who were working in the kitchen as well. Gandhi himself, by the way, spent an inordinate amount of time in the kitchen. God knows doing what, because he hardly ate anything at all. So I don't know what exactly, if I may put it this way, I do know what he was doing in the kitchen, but experimenting with raw foods, so forth and so on. But it's very clear that in the ashram itself, there was an attempt to completely break down this gender division of labor. Right? So Kishore's argument, in effect, is that he says things that are conservative, but then if you look at what he was practicing, he was far more radical in his practices. Far more radical in his practices. And this may relate to a point about the nature of Indian society as a whole, where, it's not what you say that you're going to be judged by, it's by what you do that you're going to be judged by. Right? So this is her way of trying to explain the anomaly, because the anomaly is that, yes, on the one hand, Gandhi is viewed as a person who helped to break down the distinctions between men and women in some ways, that he facilitated the entry of women into the freedom movement, he himself cultivated the feminine within him. His assassin, all right, we're going to look at that later on. This is extraordinary when we look at the assassination. His assassin, a man by the name of Nathuram Godse, when he is put on trial for having murdered Gandhi, he gives a speech. And one of the things that he says very clearly over and over again is he says that I had to do away with this old man because he was into all of these things which really are feminine. And he says, what does that have to do with building a strong nation state? If we had had an emasculated, effeminate person like Gandhi alive in India for much longer, India is going to sink into despair. This is what he says. He is acutely bothered by what he considers to be the feminine aspects of Gandhi's personality. Because what he is, of course, riding upon is this idea that the only way in which a nation earns respect in the world is by becoming a strong nation state, a masculine nation state, right? And you know, if you can understand this in various ways, but for example, if you look at China, you know, one of the things that Kissinger argued is that China would unquestionably develop a nuclear arsenal, which it eventually did, of course. It became a nuclear power, because the only way in which you earn respect in the world, Kissinger argued, is if you become a nuclear power, i.e. a highly masculinized kind of state. Right? So this is one way in which you can try to understand Gandhi's femininity, that there's certainly the people who were opposed to him unquestionably saw him as someone who had cultivated the feminine within him and within Indian society, within Indian public sphere, to a dangerous extent. All right? And according to Godse, things like fasting and praying, these are the weapons of the weak. But here when he says weak, he really is referring to women. You know, these are not things that men ought to do. Certainly not men who are going to be leaders of a nation. You know, right? It's a little bit like what Malcolm says about King at one point. He says, yeah, you know, King, all this singing that he does, you know, we shall overcome. This singing, it ain't going to get us anywhere, Malcolm says. You see, Malcolm had that kind of critique as well, at least the early Malcolm, you know, of what King was trying to do. So I'm suggesting to you that, remember what I've tried to do thus far, right? Moving into the seventh week is that after that first half of the course where we had set up the initial paradigms, then I said there's a critique, Gandhi's critique of modernity, there's Gandhi's critique of colonialism, and there's Gandhi's critique of masculinity. This is the third of the major critiques that we really are trying to understand here, right? And in order to move to that, I'll come back to some quotations from Gandhi. I want to just wrap up my analytical discussion here before I just look at a few passages from his writings. I want to look more explicitly now at Gandhi and what we might call the politics of sexuality. Right? And this takes me back to my own article because I want to articulate a difference there, which is, I think, quite important. I've spoken to a couple of you after class about this day before yesterday, but I want to adumbrate very clearly what I think is at stake here. We should not imagine that because Gandhi took a vow of celibacy in his mid-30s, we should not imagine that because Gandhi viewed the sexual act as disgusting, which he does, right? But when we say the sexual act here, we're referring in particular to sexual intercourse, right? Even between a man and his wife, right? I mean, there are times when he says that in marriage, a man and a woman ought to live like a sister and a brother. At times he says that. And recall, of course, that he himself has been married. Now, we have to deal with this. We can't run away from this because I think what we might call a common sense humane view would say that, well, Gandhi's own views of this are actually repulsive. Why should he take this view? But I had spoken to this issue in my previous lecture when I suggested to you that, in fact, there is a kind of a radical feminist critique which would agree with this part only of Gandhi's reading, namely that when we look at the act of sexual intercourse itself, we have to locate it within what we might call the history of power and the history of disproportionate power between men and women. All right? And of course, I know that the common sense view here would be that, well, yes, but you know, what about romantic love? Is it not the case that two people might not be completely attached to each other, completely devoted to each other. And this is not simply a question of whether there are infidelities and so forth and so on. That's not really what Gandhi is really referring to, right? He had a kind of revulsion at this because I think essentially he understood it to be an act of violence, all right? An act of violence. And of course he does allow for the fact that one will need to have it because this is the basis for procreation, right? Now, what Gandhi might have thought about artificial insemination and, modern reproductive technologies, so forth and so on, that's an interesting set of questions. But at least at the time that he was writing, none of this was remotely available. Or no one had really thought of that at this point in time. Test tube babies and moving from there 30 years later to everything that is available today. Surrogate motherhood, things have gone much further in the last several decades. So, having said this, I want to now talk about a distinction that I think is important. That even though Gandhi takes this view, he does not renounce sexuality. There's a difference between what I am calling sex and sexuality. Okay? And sexuality is the entire corpus of feelings and emotions that you have towards someone with whom you have some kind of attachment or affection. And it includes such things as touch. And by the way, I'm giving you an explicit argument here because it's important to understand that there is not a singularity about Gandhi's view here that you might imagine. You might think that this man is an absolute crank and lunatic and no one else has this kind of view. There are schools of thought in many religions, okay, where the argument is that when a man and a woman are engaging in sexual intercourse, that in fact the man should withdraw before consummation, complete consummation, right? In tantric sex, it's very important. And so, one of the things I discuss in my piece is the whole, for example, idea of what is the nature of semen, what are the powers that are attached to it, for example, in Taoism, in tantric schools of thought. So, in fact, there are large schools of thought where this view has been around for a while, that some element of restraint, even within the sexual act, is actually highly desirable. All right? And I'm suggesting to you that that is one context in which you can look at it. The simpler context would be that unlike those who usually renounce sex, Gandhi is not someone who renounces the company of women, for example. I mentioned to you that he is surrounded by women, he adores their company, he's got lots of female companions. In fact, there are other kinds of problems that occur there because there were so many women who were trying to get close to him, not sexually, but just because, the aura of the Mahatma, right? And there was jealousy among these women very often, who gets to really be next to the Mahatma, to be by him, to attend to his needs, so forth and so on. As there is, by the way, with these gurus nowadays. I don't know how many of you read about these Indian gurus, many of whom are very popular in the West. There's a huge amount of jealousy among the followers, who gets close to the guru, who doesn't, so forth and so on. So there's something of that going on there, right? But the important thing is that Gandhi, the importance of touch, the idea of sensuality, this was very important for him. So one should not assume that simply because he took a vow of celibacy, right, and that he had views about the nature of sexual relations, particularly sexual intercourse, which will not seem acceptable to the vast majority of people, one should not assume that therefore he found women or contact with women to be disgusting, for example. Not even remotely, right? This is very different than the relationship that a Christian monk might have had. Okay? A Christian monk might have had. And I want to sum this up by giving you a parable, which a few of you have heard, but most of you haven't, which I think would illustrate the complexities of the discussion here. And this parable comes from Buddhism. And what does a parable tell us? So there are two monks who are walking along a road, and they come to the banks of a river. Okay, it's in low tide, but there's still a fair bit of water there, a couple of feet of water. There's a woman standing there, dressed in very elegant robes. It's very clear that she wants to cross over to the other side, but she's hesitating to do so because if she does so, her dress will get wet, right? And so one of the monks there, he simply lifts her and walks across, and then when he's reached the other side, he puts her down and he continues walking. The other monk, there are two monks, right? So the other one is with him. Half an hour later, the other monk says to him, to his companion, what you did was wrong, because the monastic order that we are members of, the regulations of the order are very clear. There shall be no physical contact with women at all. And this monk says to the other one, I dropped her half an hour ago, you're still carrying her. Right? You're still carrying her. Right? So the argument there is that these things have to do with mental states as well. Right? All right. So this is, I think, important when we're trying to understand the kinds of positions that Gandhi takes. And now I want to put it in the macro level to conclude my discussion here. So there is what I'm calling, based on the work of many others, this is an argument that's not mine, but I find it a compelling argument. And the best articulation of this is in a book by Ashish Nandi called The Intimate Enemy. So he suggests that there was a colonial model of sexuality. That colonial model is that femininity, masculinity is at the top of the pyramid. The most prized thing is masculinity, right? Then you have femininity, women being women, so to speak. The worst possible thing in this model is effeminacy. What is effeminacy? Does anybody here among the students here, do you know what effeminate means? What is it? Yeah.
To like digress from masculinity. Like it's like it goes in one direction.
It goes in one direction, meaning?
Like it means to digress from your masculinity.
Yeah. For whom to digress? Men. Yes. When men display characteristics that are appropriate to women, we often say they're effeminate. It's a completely derogatory word in the English language. Just look it up. It has never had a register of meanings that you could say are commendable. So if you say of a man, oh, he's effeminate, okay? So for example, by the way, in colonial India, the British argued that all of India was effeminate. There were no real men in India at all. Of course, women are women to begin with. So a woman cannot be effeminate. Let me put it to you this way. It's not possible for a woman to be effeminate, really. She can be hyper-feminine, which is a little different. If a woman who is too excessively feminine, constantly cultivating, things that are viewed as feminine, to a hyper degree, you can say that she is hyper-feminine, okay? Where she plays up her femininity. Or what we assume to be femininity. If a woman is constantly giggling, we assume that this is a feminine feature, and if she's constantly playing up all of the things that we assume to be feminine, we could say that she's hyper-feminine. But that's not the same as being effeminate. Okay? It's not possible for a woman to be effeminate. Only men are effeminate, because when men display characteristics that are appropriate to women, we say they are effeminate. All right? So from the colonial point of view, this was the worst possible thing, right? So in the colonial scheme, masculinity is the top, then it's femininity, and then it's effeminacy. Now you can see what Gandhi is going to do, because of course men cultivating the feminine within them is indispensable if we are going to have a critique of violence. There is nothing more necessary than for men to cultivate the feminine within them if we are going to rid ourselves of the instinct for violence, right? And that is what is called androgyny. Androgyny, where you have characteristics of both the sexes within yourself. Okay? Within yourself. So there is an Indian, one of the major Indian gods is Shiva. For those of you who know a little bit about Hinduism, right? Well, all these gods appear in many forms, but one of Shiva's forms is called, I'm going to write it down here and I'll explain the word and you'll see, okay? Ardh, Nari, Ishvara. So this is one of Shiva's forms. Ardh means half. Okay, Nari means woman. And Ishvara means God. God as half woman and half man. And when you look at representations of Shiva, it's unmistakably exactly this. What do I mean by that? That you have a statue of the god Shiva, one half of it is female, the other half is male. So the female half, developed breasts, long hair, etc., etc. And then the other half is male. God as half woman, half man. That's androgyny. We can complicate it enormously, but you want to just look at the model here. So what Gandhi is effectively trying to do is put forward, in response to the colonial model, he's putting forward two models. One is a model where androgyny is the highest that we can cultivate, where we cultivate, if you're women, you cultivate the man within you too. If you're a man, you cultivate the woman within you as well, right? The second highest thing is femininity. Masculinity on this model is the lowest thing. Masculinity is a problem. It's a problem because of its intrinsic relationship to such things as violence, the nation state, so forth and so on. Okay? But he also is fully aware of the fact that cultivating the masculine or the feminine within you, depending on who you are, in addition to having the characteristics of your sex, is not easy. What would it mean? What would it entail? Well, we've seen what it entails in the case of Gandhi, the way in which he feminizes certain political practices, feminizes himself to a degree, right? Feminizes the public sphere. But this is not easy. So therefore he has a second model. And that second model is femininity is in fact greater than masculinity, and either of them is greater than cowardice or the failure of masculinity. Right? That's the second model that he has, that if you cannot cultivate androgyny within you, then if you're a woman, be the best that a woman can be. If you're a man, be the best that a man can be. And that means that you display the characteristics of your sex. So if you're a man, that would mean, among other things, that you stand up for things, right? And for him, and this goes to the question of, I've always asked this question, and it's a question that he addresses in his writings on women. Does Gandhi renounce violence in each and every instance? Is there no instance where he would not countenance the use of violence? Well, he has a lot to say on this particular subject. That there are times when it may be necessary, but we have to be very careful how we modulate this, because the minute we allow that, all right, there may be times when it may be necessary to use violence, right? But this is what I mean. If we say that, then of course it opens up the doors. right? So for example, to take the level argument at the macro level, how does it open up the doors? The just war theory in Christian theology. You know, there are Christian theologians who argue that war is to be renounced. It's a form of violence. But on the other hand, they have what they call the just war theory. And of course, in American foreign policy, every war becomes a just war, if you ask me. You can just see how it opens up the doors. Right? Well, we have to go into Iraq because we have to save these people from themselves. We have to save them from a dictator. It's a just war. We have to enter World War II because the fascists are going to take over the world. We have to enter World War I because we believe in self-determination for everybody. Every war is going to become a just war at that macro level. So therefore, it's not simply the case that Gandhi is saying that, well, you know, where necessary. No, I mean, I think that the restraints on the use of violence are enormous for him. And it is going to be only in a situation. So, for example, let's take, this gives me the occasion to go to some of these readings I'd mentioned to you, which I really want to look at. Okay, let's take a case, and I had given this reading to you, of a woman who is being sexually assaulted. Let's take a case where somebody would say there can never be any argument against the use of violence by the woman. Right? I think that this is one illustration where, let's say a woman is being sexually assaulted, should she fight back or not? Right? And if she should fight back, shouldn't she fight back with all the resources available to her? Now, by the way, there are some constraints there. You know, for example, would she, if she had a gun, would she be entitled to shoot the man? Right? If she were being sexually assaulted by a man. I mean, and courts have to look at these cases. You know, in France, there's this thing called crimes of passion. It's actually, there's a legal argument in France for what are called crimes of passion. So, if you, in a case of this kind, where a woman has been gravely wronged or insulted and she kills a man, she could be pardoned. She could be excused, you know, right? What we're looking at is not cases just in France or here or there where there may be special pieces of legislation. We're saying, let's look at it in a general sense. What ought a woman to do in a case like this? Because this is the kind of question that people constantly will say. Well, Gandhi was opposed to the use of violence, so would a woman be within her rights to actually hit the man? You know, maybe not kill him, although that might be defended by a court as a killing that was unnecessary or took place inadvertently in the act of self-defense, right? So that would be a defensible form of homicide, all right? But in general, we're saying, would she be within her rights? Right? So this is what he says. Let's just take a look at this passage. Okay? I have discussed the ashram women from learning. The woman who. One second. Let me just. Okay. So here he's talking about, and this is page 278. So you were given this reading in a PDF. Some of the pages from here. What happens when? So here he starts with the case of Sita. So Sita is a character from an Indian epic who gets abducted, right, by Ravan. Sita had no weapons, but she had soul force. Hence her consent was necessary before Ravan could so much as touch her. Our sisters, he's referring here, so he's addressing these women in the ashram where he lived. Our sisters should have self-confidence of this kind. Hence we have introduced Draupadi's prayer. This is another woman character in another Indian epic. Prayer especially for women. But we were discussing an ideal. When a woman is faced by a maniac, that sexual maniac, right? What is she to do? What is she to do? If she truly has courage in her and also compassion, instead of becoming panicky, she will melt him with the radiance of her compassion. That sounds absolutely absurd to an average reader, they'll say, this is just, the most wishy-washy, mushy thing you've ever heard your whole life, right? Okay? That here's a woman, she's being subjected to this assault. She's just going to melt the assaulter with her radiance of her compassion. But if that emotion, but here, you see, then you have to go to the next line. Because there's this ideal world, and then there's the next word. But if that emotion has not arisen in her, she will certainly become enraged. Right? You see, so he immediately understands that has this ideal conception, but that's what an ideal is. It is an ideal conception. All right? In her rage, she will slap him. And you can take the slap to mean many other things. Maybe possibly bite him, kick him in his groin, whatever she's able to do. Okay? In her rage, she will slap him and raise such a row that he will run away from the scene. Now, this, by the way, is not as unlikely a scenario, because that's what very often women had been advised to do, that, if somebody's assaulting you, you yell or shout. I remember when I was going to, I don't know if they'd still do it on the campus here today, when I was at Johns Hopkins as an undergraduate student, I remember they used to give out whistles to all the women, that if you blow the whistle, right? Well, that's what we're talking about here, right? Okay? In her rage, she will slap him and raise such a row that he will run away from the scene. Or he will fall at her feet then and there. That goes back to the earlier kind of thing. The radiance of her compassion will melt. All right? That is to say, the woman will use all her physical strength. Will that not constitute violence? If that is to be so, why not carry a weapon? Now, that's an interesting argument, right? That, look, if she's going to retaliate, by kicking him, slapping him, whatever, then why not just actually carry a weapon, right? My opinion is that there is violence in carrying and learning to use a weapon. So much for the second amendment to the Bill of Rights, okay? The whole NRA will collapse in a second the minute they took this seriously, right? My opinion is that there is violence in carrying and learning to use a weapon, right? But in a situation like the above, slapping or scratching, if the occasion demands it, does not constitute violence. Right? Now he's saying that this is not violence when she is retaliating. If there is violence in a mouse biting a cat, the conduct of a woman in such a situation would also constitute violence. The trust of a woman who slaps is not in the slap. Her trust is in God. This is quite complicated. You see, you could say that, all Gandhi is really doing is just fudging the issue. He's just saying, this is all semantics now. No, I don't think so. What Gandhi is really saying is, that when she slaps this person, and as I said, slap is just a word for retaliating. It could include kicking or whatever, right? But without a weapon, without an external thing. It's not that she expects that the slap per se will necessarily, right, yield the desired result. The desired result being he desists from the assault, ceases to assault her. The trust, rather, is in God, he says. And of course, you could say, well, let's pose a different problem. We should always try to pose the problem, because this is a Socratic method. What if you don't believe in God? What if you don't believe in God? If you're a non-believer, you're a woman who's a non-believer, and you slap or kick your assaulter, he says, it's not the slap as such in which she trusts, it's in God that she trusts. Well, what if you don't believe in God? Well, Gandhi would say doesn't matter. Why? Because then we have to understand what he really means by God here. And I want to remind you that he did have, and this is something that is discussed in that piece early on by Mahadevan, right? That initially he believed in God is truth. And then he says he eventually moved to the formulation, truth is God. Right? Now there's a difference between these two formulations. The reason why he had moved from God is truth is because when you begin with God as a subject, but you're a non-believer. If you're a non-believer, you cannot begin with God as a subject. Right? If you're an atheist, you would say, I don't even believe in God. Right? So he eventually moves to the formulation, truth becomes the subject. Because he says, there are people who don't believe in God. Fine. But there is no one who does not believe in truth. No one who does not believe in truth. And this, of course, goes back then to our earlier discussions about what is the nature of truth, is truth relative, how does one person's truth compare to another person's truth, etc., etc. We won't revisit that whole discussion here. But when he says God here, it simply means truth. And that means that you have confidence in yourself. You look into yourself. Right? So he's taking up a position, and you could say that, well, it's still not entirely clear what he's arguing. Is he arguing that women should be enabled to retaliate? And the answer is yes. That this would not constitute an act of violence, because just as non-violence is not simply the absence of violence. Similarly, violence is not just the presence of violence. In other words, that when you carry out an act, we have to also consider the mental state that accompanies that particular act. Right? And this is how Gandhi would come around to the view that there will be occasions when, in fact, the use of violence may be justified. May be justified. But this is a contentious point in the scholarship on Gandhi, whether he did or did not really allow for exceptions. All right? But let me just quickly, because pretty much wrap this up, I want to just, last point here, and then I want to go and spend a couple of minutes on one or two of the readings here, and this is a point I will reinforce in the last week especially. But his critique of masculinity is centrally tied to his critique of the nation state. I have hinted at this in my discussion of the assassin and what the assassin thought of Gandhi and why the assassin justified his assassination of Gandhi in those particular terms. When he suggested that one reason he had to eliminate Gandhi was because Gandhi exercised a huge influence on this young nation. Remember that India had been free for only 6 months. Right? India becomes free on 15th August 1947. Gandhi is assassinated on 30th January 1948. And Gandhi is still an overwhelming presence in Indian public life, even though he is not holding any office of state at all. Everybody is still going to him for advice. In fact, on the day of his assassination, he's going to be visited by the Deputy Prime Minister of India for consultations. Right? So the assassin's view was that Gandhi, he exercises an enormous presence in India, and he must be eliminated. He must be gotten out of the way, because this man, with his thinking, is going to corrupt India. Because he has all these views about a nation, about men, about women. India is going to become a feminized entity under Gandhi's influence, and therefore will not be able to hold up its head with pride in the world of real politics. Right? This is the argument of the assassin. And this shows you exactly what Gandhi's critique of masculinity, that component, namely that it is tied inextricably to his critique of the nation state. Right? To his critique of the nation state, that the nation state is this kind of entity which is really a masculinized form of doing politics. Which is why, as I said to you in my previous lecture, having Hillary Clinton or whoever, some woman like that, makes not an iota of difference with respect to the shape and nature of the nation state. All right? But here, just one passage I want to look at very briefly, and we'll terminate there. See, because you see, I think in many ways his views are extraordinarily interesting and different, and very radical in many ways. And the context for this passage that I want to look at is the fact that in India, and I think this is true of the US too, to a substantial degree, but perhaps to a lesser degree, that when women go to a doctor, when women are adults especially, you go to, if for problems having to do with women's health in particular, you go to a gynecologist and you want a female gynecologist. Okay? Now in India, this is just the norm. I mean, you know, women of my mother's generation, the idea that they would go to a male doctor for their medical problems, which are intrinsic to them as women, okay, is unthinkable. Unthinkable. I don't know a single woman even today who would do that. Okay. Now Gandhi had very different views on this, because he saw this as a false form of modesty. He saw this, in fact, as a way of not contending with this fundamental issue of sexuality. You see, right? So this is page 210. This is a letter he writes to the women in the ashram. Okay. In Phoenix, so he says, we should have confidence in ourselves. I therefore liked it very much that Shantok, this is a woman in that ashram, got herself operated upon by Dr. Haribai, a male doctor, and my belief in her courage was confirmed. In Phoenix, that's in South Africa, he's saying, we had made this a common practice. When Devdas was born, a male doctor was in attendance. That is upon Kasturbai, his wife. Right? It was performed by a male doctor. Ba, that's Kasturbai's wife, is very brave but simple about such matters. She requires my presence at such times, but that is a small matter. Everyone requires a trusted person by his or her side on such occasion, and that is but right. My purpose in writing about all this is to explain to you that in the ashram we should cultivate this type of courage and abandon false shame. Abandon false shame. Hundreds and thousands of women suffer because of such shame. We have before us Vidyavati's example. This is another woman in the ashram. She would not let her private parts be examined even by a woman doctor. We wish to cultivate the innocence of Shukdevji. We should not, of course, pretend to have it so long as we have not succeeded in acquiring it. There are men whose passion is aroused by the mere touch of a woman, and there are likewise women who are aroused by the mere touch of a man. Such persons should certainly force themselves to live as untouchables, right? Etc., etc. Right? You see, it's a very radical argument that he's really making here. That just as you cannot cultivate nonviolence unless you confront violence head on, similarly, you cannot really cultivate virtue by these forms of false shame and modesty. You're running away from it. You have to confront this head on. The other thing, which would not strike you, I would say, until I mention it explicitly, but when I mention it explicitly, it'll appear to you. Imagine a leader, a man of this stature, who is revered at this point, is undisputably the most well-known person in India, writing letters to ashram women about such things. You see, he did not compartmentalize his life, and if we say, oh, Gandhi is really just all about, leading this campaign or that campaign. Now you begin to see that there was nothing that was left untouched under his canvas, because he saw all of these as integral to a certain kind of worldview. So he is writing letters about nutrition. I can't tell you how many pages he wrote about things like nutrition, diet, hygiene, toilets, you name it, right? Not to mention economic issues, spinning, weaving. It's for no reason that the collected works run into 100 volumes. All right, so we'll stop there.